And welcome, students, as we get into our lessons about programming. So before we kind of sink our teeth a little bit into actually writing some programming, let's first go ahead and discuss exactly what is programming. So I first want to take a second to differentiate between coding and programming. They're two different paradigms of a very similar field. So we've had experience practicing coding kind of up to this point, but you're really going to take your first foray into actual programming. They're very similar, but they're a little distinct. So what is ultimately the difference? Well, coding in its modern lexicon often refers to the early stages of programming and is often used as a teaching tool. They call them like script kiddies and stuff like that, the words that you might hear tossed around. So this is, people who might take, for example, existing lines of code and use it in a program. They're not writing it from scratch. They might have a knowledge of how it works and know how to modify things a little bit, but they're not necessarily writing everything from the ground up. So coding is, using existing things to kind of learn some of those logical operations. Like you might know how to use like conditionals and loops and stuff like that. Whereas programming, on the other hand, refers to the building of a programming or application in order to solve problems, handle logical operations, so on and so forth. In fact, a lot of the stuff that goes on with coding is actually just a small piece of programming. So you can think of coding as kind of like just a small introduction into the larger field of programming. Obviously, you're going to be coding when you're programming because you're writing lines of code, but programming is generally considered to be the much more traditionalist approach where you're writing full-on applications and stuff like that. And we won't quite get into all the nuances of that in the scope of what we're learning, but we're going to get a good introduction into some of those fundamentals. So now that we've kind of got that out of the way of the two differences there, what actually is programming? Well, programming is the writing of instructions or code, and there it is again, that tells a computer or machine what task you want to perform. Now, programming languages are what's known as artificial languages. They're used to communicate instructions to a machine. They're not, obviously natural languages like what you and I speak, but they are languages still because they still have rules like syntax and grammar that they're going to use. Now, program code is used in everything from microwaves to your television, gaming consoles, tablets, and various applications. There's different ways that these languages work. There's many programming languages out there. A lot of them are used in different applications for what their little niche market is. But otherwise, they are prolific. Like there's so many things that programming can be used for. So it's not simply just like an app or a video game or some kind of web tool. There's a lot of different things that programming actually goes into in terms of what it can do. So with all these different things that programming can get onto, how does it change from one machine to the next? All right, because obviously a microwave is going to be doing a lot different things than, let's say, Facebook. Well, the code is the instructions needed to perform the task. Remember we talked about the code. Well, that is the instructions. So obviously what you write for a microwave is going to be very different from Facebook. What a machine does, therefore, with that code is going to be very based upon what's actually present in there. So it's going to vary, from application to application. There might be some similarities for similar apps, but ultimately it is going to have some variance. Now, there are, of course, several different levels of programming languages. All right, we're not going to kind of really sink too much our teeth in this, but it's just good for you to know. There's machine code and assembler level. That's things like binary, hexadecimal assembly. This is things that are much more closer to what the computer is actually going to interpret and use. You have interpreter languages and compiler languages. That's languages like C. These are languages that are higher order than that of something like an assembler language. So you're written a little closer to words that you and I might use, but because they aren't at that full level, like an object-oriented language, they are much more closely tied to the machine. An object-oriented, obviously, you're creating virtual objects. All right, I'm not going to have you work too much about what that means, but in those languages, you're creating objects that manipulate various properties that you're going to be working with. Now, we're going to examine Python for our purposes, and Python is considered a general use programming language. All right, it can do things like it can be object oriented. It's not a full object oriented language, but it can exhibit some of those properties. It can do some other things. It's used a lot, for example, in web side stuff. So it does a lot of handling with different things there. So that is going to be it for today, folks. It's a quick introduction. We're going to do a couple more things, and then next thing you know, next lesson, we're actually going to start wrapping our minds a little bit around what Python is and what it can do. So until then.